you have to remember when you watch something like this movie, not a single bit of it is random or accidental. None of it. Because, you know, they had to draw, I don't remember how many frames per second these things are, 30 maybe. Maybe it's a little less than that, but it's high quality animation. And so someone had to paint 30 pictures to get a second of this. You're not doing that accidentally. It's really expensive. And everyone has to agree on exactly what's going to happen. And you might say, well, do the people who are doing this consciously know what they're doing? And the answer to that is, well, sort of, just like you do. You know, it's yes, they know, and no, they don't. And they know because they're really smart and gifted and all that, but they don't know because it's not all articulated, plus they're working in a group. So they know and don't know, just like you do when you're watching it, and so and when you do anything else. So now they're also guided by what you might call, they're guided by their unconscious in the Freudian and in the cognitive way, partly because your unconscious value structures determine the direction and content of your perceptions. And so it's built right into the way you move your eyes, because you tend to look at things you value, right? Or at things you're afraid of. Like you look at things with valence, and part of the decision about what has value is dependent on the implicit structure of your moral system, because morality is about what's good and what isn't, and that's been partly a conscious construction of you, but it's partly something you've picked up by interacting with people like mad ever since you were born. You don't know all the rules any more than the damn cricket did. You just don't, and you can't, because you're too complicated. But you act them out, and then you also have representations of how people act in your imagination. Dreams are, that's what a dream is, that's what a fantasy is. That's what that little movie that plays inside your head when you remember what you did is. And you only remember the gist, you know. So even the imagistic representation of your behavior in your past, which is basically your episodic memory, it's already selecting and molding and turning it into a relatable story. It can't help but do that. It's the only way you can represent it. And so you don't know how you do that or why you do that, but part of it's governed by this implicit morality that's part of your procedural memory system, part of the way you act and part of the way you move your eyes and listen to things and focus on them. And that's all being instantiated inside of you because of this immense social, your biology, but also this immense social project that you're continually engaged in. And so that informs what you remember, it informs what you imagine, it informs what we collectively imagine, it informs what we can collectively understand. And partly what you're doing while you become conscious of yourself is to map the implicit structures that already constitute you from society into explicit representation. That's what self-understanding means. And you know, when you have that moment of insight about something you've done, it's like you're watching this repetitive behavior that you've manifested, probably that got you in trouble. You know, it's your characteristic way of falling accidentally into chaos, and you talk about it, and your problems, you talk about them with your friends, you talk about them, and maybe you have dreams about them, and you're trying to relate them, and you have memories about them that you can't get rid of because they're negatively toned, and so you talk about them, and then someone comes up with a little statement that links them together causally, and you think, aha, that's what I'm doing. And then maybe you can stop doing it, or at least maybe then you can think up some strategies for not doing it anymore. But it's not like you know. It's like you're acting it out. You know it that way. But until the representation matches that pattern, that click of insight doesn't occur. And that's like a revelation. It's a really good way of thinking about it. Because the knowledge is there in its implicit form, and all of a sudden, bang, it's been made explicit. As a fantasy maybe, or also as a set of semantic statements. You know, maybe you have a crush on someone and you don't notice it, and maybe you find yourself having a fantasy about them. You think, oh, that means something, that indicates something. Maybe you don't want to know that that's what you want, but the fantasy will tell you. And one of the things Jung suggested, and this is sort of out of the Freudian tradition of free associations, is watch yourself, watch your fantasies, because they're always happening. And they'll tell you something. And so one of the things I do when I'm interacting with my clients is we'll have a discussion, and then their eyes will drift a little bit, and I'll know that something's flitted through their mind, you know, and that means we've touched on something that has a multiplicity of elements. And so I'll stop and say, look, I noticed that maybe you teared up. That's another thing to really watch. Or maybe you laughed. Or you drifted at least. It's because some other thought has entered your field of consciousness, and then if you can get the person to grab those thoughts, to notice them, then you can often figure out the avenues along which that particular conversation might unfold. That's a complex. That's a Jungian complex or a psychoanalytic complex. It's like there's an emotional core that produces a whole range of associated ideas, and that thing's got a life. It's like a micro-personality, and it might have resentment in it, might have anger. It's often negative emotion tinged, because though negative emotion tinged episodes are still problems, and they will emerge automatically because your threat detection systems force them onto your consciousness, essentially. So you watch, and when you drift, you'll drift, and the fantasy is partly a representation of the problem space. You know that happens when you wake up at 3 in the morning and you're worried about things, right? Because actually what happens is you wake up during threat processing, and if you're depressed, actually that gets so intense you can't sleep, so then you just lay there all night worrying. Not fun. And those are fantasies about the negative elements of your past, present, and future. And the fantasies can also breed solutions, and that's partly why Freud regarded dreams as wish fulfillments. It's partly, and he wasn't, that was where he stopped. It's not correct. It's partially correct. It's like the fantasy will provide you with a problem and a potential solution, but they're more like problem identification mechanisms, the fantasies, with the possibility of a solution built in. And so a way of thinking about that is that you can generate potential futures. So they're like each segregatable environments according to the rules of your fantasy. Then you can generate little avatars of yourself that inhabit each of those little universes, and you can run them as simulations. And then you can watch what happens in the simulation, and if it's a catastrophe, then you don't have to act it out. And that's exactly, not exactly, that's akin to what you're doing when you go watch a movie, except that is much more coherent and well thought through, you know, than just a dream, which is often quite fragmentary. And that's partly because the dream is willing to sacrifice coherence to play with category structures, you know, and that's why in dreams things can change from one thing into another really weirdly, or scenes can change from one scene into another without a logic. The logic gets loosened so that the expanse of your thinking can widen, and it's dangerous to do that, and that's partly why you do it when you're asleep and paralyzed. You know, you don't run around and act out your pseudopodal fantasies, you know, where you're stretching yourself out into the world. There's no risk exactly, and so, although it can be bad enough so you'll wake up in terror, you know, but that's better than being in a crocodile's mouth by a large margin. I've been trying to educate people about the horrors of the Nazi regime and the Soviet regime in particular. I've concentrated mostly on those two because that's good enough. And trying to let people know that it was through the fault of people much like them that those systems arose, and that there are steps you can take to limit the probability that you would participate in such a thing, and that those steps are associated with trying to be truthful in your speech and actions, because the stability of those systems depends on the willingness of individuals to lie, and also on your willingness to take responsibility for the malevolence in your own heart that manifests itself in those social movements. And so that when I do my lectures, when I do talks like this, when I put them on YouTube, what I'm trying to do is exactly that, because that was the best pathway forward through such things that I could think up over 20 years of thinking about it. No one is so habituated to suffering that they can read the Gulag Archipelago, which is actually quite hard to read, without having it affect them. Like, you're psychopathic if that book doesn't affect you, you know. It should, if you read it properly, it affects you deeply. And it's not the only example of that kind of literature. So the people who are habituated aren't. They've just been shown low-resolution representations of things they don't understand that look vaguely bad. They don't know a damn thing about them. And our education system has done a tremendously appalling job of educating young people about the absolute catastrophe of radical leftism. Now, it's not much better with regards to, say, the actions of the Nazis, although I would say on average people are more aware of that. But they don't, but it's shallow knowledge. So you make the knowledge deep, and deep knowledge changes people and wakes them up. You know, I mean, the only reason that I ever got convinced that that good and evil were real, more real than anything else, wasn't because I learned that good was real. That's hard. That's hard. It's hard to learn that. You have to find examples of transcendent good, you know. They're rare. Evil, all you have to do is look. You read history a bit. And read it like it's about you. And there's no way that you can do that without a transformation. But people won't do it. It's like, you want to imagine yourself as an Auschwitz guard? That's a rough thing, you see, because you have to figure out. See, Jung said if you confronted the shadow, which was the dark side of people, the aggressive side, the malevolent side, that it really reaches all the way down to hell. And Dante sort of was trying to put forward the same thing when he wrote the Inferno, right, with the levels of evil, right, because it was a voyage through the levels of evil right to the bottom. He thought the bottom was betrayal. It's pretty good. The center of malevolence is betrayal. I like that because to betray someone, you have to get them to trust you, and trust is a moral virtue, right, especially if it's courageous trust, because it puts you in alignment with other people and allows you to move forward into life. And if you betray that, it's like a knife it's like a knife in the heart through the back, especially if it's someone who loves you, betrays you. And especially if they betray you for your virtues. That's a really nice twist. So, I believe, because I think that people are capable of good, that if they know enough about evil, that will straighten them out. So, but who wants that? You know, this is one of the things I really like about Jung. He's often regarded as a New Age thinker. That's wrong. He's no New Age thinker. He knew that the pathway to enlightenment was barred by the necessity of a passage through hell. And that no one was going to do that. That's why there isn't a world full of enlightened people, you might say. Like if it was just a matter of doing nice things, following your bliss, let's say, however you might put it, then why wouldn't everyone walk up the stairway to heaven? That isn't how it works. That's not how it works at all. I don't think you can be convinced of the necessity for moral action until you understand exactly how dark and terrible things can get, and that it's your fault that they're getting that way. Who wants to think that? So, you can think it though, but not without it burning you.